Hi, my name is Dr. Asia Eaton. I'm a psychological scientist and public psychologist, and this is Mindbridge, where science meets human rights. In this podcast, we invite human rights defenders to teach and learn from brain and behavioral scientists about how we can all use science to do human rights work that is more efficient and impactful.
Hello. Today is January 15th, 2026, and for this episode, we will be exploring technology-facilitated sexual violence, including the human rights abuse of image-based sexual abuse, which is the non-consensual creating, taking, or sharing of intimate images, including threats to share. For today's guests, we have Emma Holten and Afroditi Pina. Emma Holten is a feminist activist and gender policy consultant. Since 2018, she's worked with feminist economics. In 2024, she published her first book, Deficit, on the value of care in Danish. It is available in English, Swedish, Norwegian, German, Dutch, Finnish, and Italian, and forthcoming in several other languages. It has won the Politiken Literature Prize, the Library Readers Prize, the Sarah Danius Prize, the Sprout Prize, and was shortlisted for the Montana Literature Award. Welcome, Emma.
Thank you so much. It sounds so impressive when you say it like that. I don't feel like that in real life, I guess.
It sounds impressive because it is impressive.
Exactly.
Thank you.
Our other guest is psychological scientist Afroditi, who is a reader or associate professor in forensic psychology at the University of Kent. She's a researcher and academic with expertise in forensic and social psychology, focusing on sexual violence, gender equality, victimization, and perpetration. Her work includes research on image-based sexual abuse, sexual harassment, stalking and domestic abuse, and scale development for the measurement of their perpetration. She's published extensively on the aforementioned topics, and her research has informed policy and practice in the UK and beyond. Welcome, Afroditi.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a real pleasure.
So, Emma, we'll start with you. How did you get involved in work on image-based sexual abuse and technology-facilitated violence?
Yeah, so this was not on my radar at all, but you can I think safely say that I was kind of flung into it because I was a victim of this type of crime when I was 20 years old in 2011. Someone hacked into my email. I don't know who, but they did so and changed my password so I couldn't enter. And upon doing that, they took some naked images that I had sent to my boyfriend when I was 17 and 18 and published them on 4chan along with identifying information such as phone number, address, workplace, with an encouragement to harass me. And as I said, this was in 2011, which is, in internet years, it's light years from now. And at that point, we did not at all have such a mature conversation about this type of crime. Victims like me were left completely to our own devices. There was basically no criminal recourse, no societal support system. So we were left very, very much alone to struggle with this very, very intense and sustained crime, which does not end on the day that it happens. It continues to happen to you constantly. And 3 years after this happened to me in 2014, I did a project called Consent, an art project with a photographer called Cecilia Bødker, where I took new naked images and wrote an article and published it as an art project, highlighting the humanity of victims of digital sexual violence. And I was 23 years old and did not at all expect for it to gain the attention that it did. But it ended up becoming one of the first pieces of art and text written from the perspective of an actual survivor of this type of violence. And I spent the 10 years following that advocating for victims' rights and for the severity of this crime and for even to be seen as a crime and for us as victims to be seen as blameless. And I still work on this in different types of ways, but now luckily I've also moved on a little. I work with care, but I think my new work is also very much rooted in how to build a society with more solidarity and empathy. So I think there's some previous trauma buried in my feminist economics work as well.
Emma, thank you for your advocacy. Thank you for your vulnerability and sharing that with us. And thank you for showing other survivors a multitude of paths towards healing. Let me ask you, Aphrodite, what do you study in plain language, and how did you get involved in this work?
I've been, as you said, studying various aspects of sexual violence or, harassment, domestic abuse for almost 20 years, like since I started my academic career. So I've been in this field, like from an academic perspective, for a long time. I've always really been interested and examined the ways that people, like how and why people behave in harmful ways. I was always like really fascinated by that. And how this relates to traits that they have in their personality, like specific sort of characteristics, and also distorted thinking. And I'll explain in a bit what I mean by that. So for the last 10 years, I focused on the use of technology to perpetrate these aforementioned crimes, like, sexual violence, harassment, stalking, all of those things, and intimate partner violence. And I was really always interested in how it impacts victims. And it's so sobering to hear Emma's take on this and Emma's experience on this, because I started back in 2015, which was 4 years after Emma had been victimized. And at that time, we had just started, kind of like looking into this phenomenon. I remember specifically, it started during supervision with me. It was one of my male master's supervisees, basically. He comes in and we're discussing consent, because obviously my research is sexual violence. And he's like, oh, there's this thing, like that keeps sort of like doing the rounds on the internet and forums that I'm in. And people are just taking images of like their ex-girlfriends or girlfriends and they share them with other people. And there's discussion about that. And I was horrified at the time, but I was really kind of like fascinated because of the lack of consent element. So, obviously the concepts were really intriguing to me. So we started, discussing ways that we could look into this and how could we ask people questions about what is the motivation behind doing things like that, what makes them do this. So we came up with an instrument, a scale, to measure basically people's likelihood to engage in this practice, to engage in this obviously crime. So we started at the time, which I have to clarify, and there's a reason why I'm clarifying, because at the time back in 2015, all of the talk around this phenomenon was circling revenge, and they were talking about the dissolution of relationships and jilted ex-lovers that are doing these things to to their partners. So again, Emma's situation would have been something that wouldn't fit in that scenario, even though obviously now that the research has evolved, we know very well that it is part of this. So our initial instrument included scenarios basically that looked at current or dissolved relationship situations where it was gender neutral, and where the person would then take, they would take the images and they would share them, okay, without the consent of the person that was in there. What we wanted to see is whether people would be likely to admit to us that they would do this practice, if obviously the conditions were like, if they weren't going to get caught or anything like that, as proclivity scales normally work. And we found that there are certain traits that are linked with people's likelihood to engage in that behavior. I mean, that was the first kind of like back in 2015, 2016 that we analyzed the data. And we found that traits like callousness, lack of empathy, sexism, like having adverse beliefs about women, led to an increased likelihood for people to take part in intimate images. So since then, obviously since 2016, I've been conducting a lot more studies on the topic and keep finding the presence of these, what we call in psychology, dark personality traits like psychopathy, narcissism, sadism, Machiavellianism. I found links with victim blame, what Emma was saying about, like needing with her activism to show people that victims are blameless. Okay, so we find that victim blame is a mechanism that exists a lot in this behavior, misogyny, and also distorted thinking, like morally justifying people's wrongdoing, either displacing their responsibility or dehumanizing victims so that they can carry on, sort of like blameless doing this.
So you both have already sort of hinted at the fact that research and practice related to image-based sexual abuse has grown a lot in the last 10 to 15 years. And, originally the media was describing the phenomenon as revenge porn. We've come to learn there's not only a variety of motivations for engaging in image-based sexual abuse, but it is not something that we call pornographic. It is abuse. Tell me, Emma, in the long period during which you've been advocating for reform and justice around this issue, what are some steps that we still need to take towards justice today? What does justice in this sphere look like for you?
So I think it's had many phases, right? Because it's developed along with our acknowledgement that the internet is real life. And I think that was kind of the first hurdle that we as activists even had to have, because I had to, first of all, argue for why I felt, quote unquote, the need to document or use the internet in my sexuality, which, of course, we know now is extremely common among people of all genders, all classes, all races. If you do it, you also do it online. There is basically no part of our sexuality, our work life, our relationships, friendships that does not have a digital mirror. So at the same time, of course, our sexuality will have a digital mirror. But that was kind of the first thing where I had to explain myself. I did a lot of explaining myself in the first couple of years and excusing myself. And I think that that was something that was very important in the consent project, was that I was sick of every victim of digital sexual abuse having to come out and say, "Oh, I was so stupid. I took those pictures. I regret it. I'm a much better person now." And I very flatly refused to do that. And that created a lot of backlash in my work. But now looking back, I'm both surprised that I was so brave, but very glad that I did it, because it was so counterproductive to do that. And we spent a lot of time kind of saying, "Oh yeah, it's terrible what happened to you, but you were also kind of stupid." And that was kind of the narrative around us. But I think as the internet penetrated our lives more and more and more, it became clear that, a person who is violent in the home towards his partner will use the internet for violence as well. So the internet will mirror kind of these types of violence that we are already familiar with. So this is a modern day catcall. It is a modern day domestic violence. It is a modern day, drug rape. Then you'll just find these digital ways, these digital shapes that this age-old sexism and age-old oppression and age-old violence is already taken. So I think that was kind of the first hurdle. And I think the next thing was to really humanize us who are victims. I think there was a very strong cultural reaction, which was to kind of marginalize us as kind of exceptions. So we were not someone's daughter, we were not someone's whatever. We were people with these deviant types of sexualities. And I'm not at all in denial about the fact that I think one of the reasons that my activism in this area was successful was that I was white and skinny and well educated and from like a quote unquote good family and a nice part of Copenhagen. And I could kind of argue for myself and speak for myself, because many of the victims that were more visible in Denmark online in this period of time were working class women or poor women. Women were sex workers, migrants, or just simply poor and under-resourced in different types of ways. So it became very easy culturally to kind of cordon us off and say this doesn't happen to normal women. So I think so much of the work was humanizing us as being citizens on a level with everybody else. And I think this was actually one of the worst experiences of this type of crime, was not only the fact that there were these violent individuals online or whatever who were threatening me and harassing me. I think for many of us who were victims, the long-term damage was feeling the social exclusion from other types of everyday spheres as well, workplaces, friendships, relationships, community work, where I think facing the fact that this could happen to everybody and even to themselves was too scary for people. So in order to cope with the fact that it happened, they said inside their head, they said, "But there's something different about Emma. That would never happen to me. It would never happen to my daughter." And that distance that was made between me and what other people perceived as normal people, and I know this happens to rape victims as well, victims of domestic violence suffer the same thing, where people kind of make this chasm between you and them. And that was extremely painful. And I think when I look back now, being 15 years older than when this happened, I think that is what has really manifested long term in me in terms of psychological damage of this type of crime. Because I think coping with the fact that there are people on the internet who are violent and dehumanizing is extremely painful, but it is possible. But being ostracized from school groups, from workplaces, from people not wanting to date you, not wanting to invite you to social functions, that is what really was long-term painful and very difficult for me. And I think that is still the work that we're doing as survivors, is to normalize us in a way, reintroduce ourselves into the social fabric. That is very painful for people because it forces them to confront that it could happen to them just as well as it happened to me. And that is very difficult for people to face when it comes to sexual violence.
Yeah, you know what? When I hear you discussing the personal impacts, I am reminded of how much victims of different kinds of sexual violence share. We've known for a long time that people are motivated to believe in a just world, and they justify current systems to support that belief. And that it involves derogating victims, putting them in the out group, or psychologically distancing themselves from victims so that it doesn't feel like that could happen to them. I saw Aphroditi nodding her head vigorously, and I'll give her the opportunity to jump in with some thoughts as well.
Oh, thank you, Asia. I mean, listening to Emma is, as you said, like, it's not, we hear and we read transcripts of, sort of like experiences of victims in our research all the time. We understand, and I guess both do what we do because we want to help out and we want to eliminate this. But it really does bring home the fact that we are talking about attitudes first and foremost, and like people's sort of like thinking patterns in either, wanting to distance themselves because that's their coping mechanism and that's how they deal with, everyday life, or because they want to justify, wrongdoing and they want to feel better about it, like moral disengagement, for example. But people are doing this. And I think the really important thing that we now know from research, and we didn't back then, is that this is a form of sexual violence. I was listening to Emma and she was like, well, we were trying to make them see that we were no different. We were trying to make them see that we are human beings. We were trying to make them see of the long-term effects that this has on our life, that it doesn't just stop with the abuse. It carries on, and it carries on because of those erroneous beliefs that people are holding. You mentioned rape victims, basically, and what we find in research nowadays is that the actual impact of online versus offline is not that different. We see that, obviously research, not just my own, but other people's as well, is finding so many parallels that these victims are experiencing somatic, psychosomatic, psychological, practical side effects that are long lasting. But also what we find, and what we found with research that I was doing with my former PhD student and now collaborator, Jenna Harewell, is we found that actually in the perpetration field, the same things that predict offline sexual violence, the same things that predict rape, such as like myth acceptance, sexism, things like that, they are the exact same things that predict online abuse as well, kind of strengthening the argument that we are not talking about something different. We're talking about sexual violence, and these are victims, and it's just literally a different forum. It is real life. That is our life. You're absolutely correct. That is exactly what's going on. The other thing that happened fairly recently, and sort of like going back to the whole thing of like, this is an evolving field and now we understand a lot better about it. It's not about revenge. It's not pornography. It is sexual violence. It is that thing, quite clearly, is the phenomenon of deepfakes, right? Because in the deepfake phenomenon, we have women that did not share. Not that I'm blaming, like, obviously this is something that we do. This is how we socialize nowadays. We communicate via messages, sending pictures, things like, everyone has done it. All of us have done it at some point. But with deepfakes, you had people that never shared intimate images with anybody, but still had pornographic videos of themselves stitched together from images that people would randomly get online, and they would superimpose it onto a pornographic video in their likeness. And the effects of that were traumatizing for those victims because their memories were being altered. They couldn't look back at pictures of their lives because things are, and that brought home the fact that actually, like, how can you blame a victim anyway for the choices of a perpetrator? But that actually helped people understand that when someone wants to do that and they're motivated to do that, it doesn't matter whether you sent it or not. They will find a way for whatever reason, for whatever motivation they have to cause harm.
Yeah, I think this was something that came up a lot in the beginning. What are the motivations for the people who do this? And I was constantly being confronted with the opinion that the men, and it were mostly men who were participating in the direct abuse, but women also participated in the shaming, of course, and the ostracizing, but that it had to do with sexual desire, that this was kind of driven by men's desire to see naked women. And I constantly had to confront this argument and say, there are so many women online who are there by their own free will. If you want to see a naked woman online, it is not difficult. It is almost difficult to avoid it, right? The text that I wrote for the Consent Project in 2014 actually deals exactly with this, with the sexualization of non-consent, with the people who cannot separate what they perceive as their own sexual desire is actually abuse. Because their ability to empathize with the person that they claim they desire, but what they actually desire is to abuse a person. They cannot separate it. And I think that that's something that I've been thinking a lot about in the past, that the more the internet has taken over our lives, the more it shapes our relationships, is whether this lack of empathy has actually spread and become a more severe issue because of what I perceive to be very, very widespread kind of humiliation culture online, as well as a lack of privacy, understanding of the concept of privacy. For me, it is stunning to see people, for example, taking pictures of others in public space without their consent, filming other people in public safe spaces without their consent, showing images of their little children without the children knowing they're being filmed. We're seeing just an avalanche of content that are variations over the concept of non-consent and of humiliation as entertainment. And I think it was the crime that I was a victim to in 2011 was purer back then. It was more pure because it was more marginalized. Pictures like mine, they were showing up on these weird little blogs and weird porn sites. But now I see much more a sliding scale of consent violations in different types of spaces, of humiliation across different types of spaces, of unwanted sexualization in different types of spaces. I think the newest one was this incident on X with the Grok AI app that can, in 1 second, take a picture of any woman and turn it into a naked picture or an underwear picture, with people just doing it for entertainment, just with no sort of any reflection on how this feels for the person who it happens to. And that's where I think, in some ways, even though the research and the attention towards victims and the knowledge of this crime has greatly expanded, and the avenues we have to claim our rights have greatly expanded, in some ways, I also see regression in this area, that many more people are participating in what I would call consent violations and absorbing and seeing consent violations without registering them for what they really are. And that's been, wild to see, worrying to see.
Yeah, I was going to ask you at one point, what were some of the main challenges you experienced in your day-to-day work, Emma? And I think this sliding scale of consent violations absolutely is something that we're all coming up against, and the problem of lack of privacy and technology's role in that. Aphroditi, what are some of the suggestions or lessons from your program of research or any program of research that could support Emma with these kind of challenges?
Emma touched upon obviously a really big issue in my eyes as well, like that we are always playing catch up with technology. We're always playing catch up in terms of like legislation, in terms of research, in terms of understanding technology, and sort of like people's use of it or misuse of it always seems to surprise us and kind of like, take over and like, what is this new thing? Like this grok issue and stuff like that. I mean, obviously it's nothing new in the deep fake world, but like the sheer scale of it and the sheer kind of like, the use of it and how sort of like it erupted, it never stops surprising us, I think, as humans, as researchers, as activists, as anything. And I think it's really important to try and figure it out. I don't know if I have the answer, but I do genuinely feel that the more we understand about how people, what people's thought patterns are, like what their motivations are and why they keep doing this. Again, Emma and Asia, you both touched on this. Like we presumed that it was about certain motivations like jealousy or, revenge or whatever it is. And we find out that it's not just about that. And it's not about sexuality. It might be because people just want to make money. You see online that, these images and videos are monetized, and people are exchanging them for other things. Like there's always something, like there's always kind of like a different nuance to, to evil things, I suppose, that people can do. I think the useful things to emerge from research, such as my own, but obviously all of the other colleagues around the world, is the information that we now have on who is more likely to engage in this behavior and why, and not just that it happens. We know it happens, and we know that it's going to take different formats, but we also know that sharing intimate images or sharing intimate material of whatever format that is, whether it's real or fake, is not just random, but it's linked to specific patterns of thought. This lack of empathy that you mentioned, this, kind of like disregard of consent, this reconstruction of, who's a victim, who's not, what it's not just me, it's everyone else. Like all of those patterns, all of those distorted patterns are to blame. And we know that, like predictors, systematic predictors of image-based sexual abuse are there. Like it's sexism, it's personality traits, certain kind of like dark personality traits, it's lack of empathy, it's moral disengagement. It's a lot of different things that kind of like help us build a picture. And I think this information can help us with education and awareness, because as I said, we're always playing catch up, and we always will play catch up. So I think the only way that we can, I guess, deal with this is by starting to tackle the attitudes that are behind it. Technology is just a facet of what is underneath. Like if people are blaming victims, they will blame them either online or offline, right? Like they will have victim blaming attitudes, they will have misogyny, they will have distorted thinking, and all of those things are linked with proclivity and perpetration of those types of crimes. So it'll help us to develop, I guess, education programs that start from really, really young ages of like internet literacy as well. Like how do you actually engage with content online? I think that our kids need to learn that first and foremost. I have a 9-year-old son, and he genuinely doesn't really know at this stage he kind of has an idea of what's right and wrong. He knows he's not allowed to watch YouTube. Sometimes he will try it on. But with the things that he's being exposed to, I don't think he genuinely understands the concept of empathy, the concept of consent. These are things that I have to explain, and I think schools have to explain from a really, really young age to people. Digital etiquette, kind of like victim blaming attitudes, all of these things need to be obviously addressed. But I also think that there has to be, as someone in forensic psychology right now, is that there have to be intervention programs, for example, that are quite specific, and this information about what characteristics people have will help us to tailor intervention programs for people if they do get apprehended and if they do get punished as they should because they're committing sexual crimes. How do we rehabilitate those people? How do we help them out? So finally, people such as yourself, Emma, like victim advocacy or policymakers, lawmakers, knowing what characteristics people have helps us with detecting risks, like who's more risky obviously to engage in that thing, what can we do? So that can strengthen obviously lawmaking and things like that. But really The problem is outdated assumptions, right? We assumed that people had revenge on their mind when they were doing that. We assumed that, victims, for example, back then had some sort of like issues with their sexuality, as you said, or anything like that. These are outdated assumptions, and all of our judgments are based on assumptions about other people's sort of like intent. So overall, what I can say as a take-home message is that image-based sexual abuse as sexual violence, as an intricate facet of that, is basically it's caused and rooted by recognizable psychological patterns. Okay, it's nothing new. It's basically psychological patterns that we've known for a very long time are linked with domestic abuse or sexual violence. And it helps us understand that despite obviously new platforms, technologies, expertise, all of these things are evolving and will keep evolving, right? And posing new threats. That's going to keep happening. But the source of the problem is people's mindsets and people's, kind of like intentions and attitudes and behaviors. And as long as these are successfully targeted via either appropriate education or interventions, then we can hopefully be able to better respond and kind of like target those incidences of abuse, and maybe hopefully one day try to eliminate that if possible.
So Aphrodite has told us a little bit about predictors of perpetration and how that can help us create interventions. She shared some other things about what we know related to motivations of perpetrators. What questions do you want scientists to answer? What do you need from the field of brain and behavioral science?
I think something that I've always been curious about is kind of the element of sexism, which is something that I can only talk about anecdotally, of course, but which is that for a lot of people, and it seems many of them men, but also quite a lot of women, just the basic act of seeing someone in fugue and in not much clothing automatically dehumanizes that person. Aphrodite already talked about it, even when it is an AI generated image, even when it is not even real of the person, you immediately think that something about them has been revealed, which reveals, in a way, their true character or their baseness. And I think this was something that really struck me in the first couple of years of my victimization, which was that there were simply people who were treating me differently. Even people I had known for quite a while suddenly perceived me as less deserving of respect, and I don't even think they did it intentionally. I could just tell they thought, she has been revealed to me as not worthy. And it was odd because, I grew up in Denmark. We have a quite progressive sexual culture in Denmark, one of the most progressive in the world. It is completely normal for 15-year-old young people to have sexual relationships with their partners. I was at this point, 18, 19, 20, and had a partner for a long while. There was absolutely no doubt among the people that I knew that, of course, we had a sexual relationship. Yet, even when this happened, people still felt that I had somehow been revealed as in the gutter, to put it harshly. And I think that's something that's been very interesting to me. What is it about the naked body that we still, even though we are so super, super exposed to nudity, to sex in all sorts of different arenas, seeing, someone naked or in a sexual situation makes it difficult for us to align that with what we know about them already. Their humanity, their personality, their dreams and wishes and whatever. And I think that was something that really struck me, that people said to me, it's difficult for me to look at you in the same way. And I just thought, why? Why is this? And I think that's something that I've been curious about for so long. What is it that we think it reveals still in our culture? One thing is 200 years ago, but now with the extreme exposure we're seeing, what is it that is being revealed, and why is it so difficult for people to see a naked person as a full human being? That's something that, I think I've spent quite a lot of time thinking about that in my life.
I appreciate that insight, that we associate nudity with sexualization and sexualization with objectification. And why do we couple these things? Some cultures, couple them more than others. And maybe that's a starting point for understanding how these processes end up so intertwined. And then, of course, it differs as a function of the survivor's gender, and racial identity and sexual identity and so on. Aphroditi, you've given us a sense of some interventions. What are some other ways that people working towards digital justice and justice insofar as, sexual violence goes can use your research in their daily work?
It's always like really tricky when I come to speak of these things, especially to people like Emma, for example, who's present, who's already been kind of like doing a lot of this amazing work in kind of like spreading the word and changing the way that we look at things. So genuinely, obviously, I am in awe, and I really, really admire all of the work that you've been doing. And what you said and what Asia obviously characterized, I kept thinking objectification of Asia. Obviously, she knows a lot about this research element as well. Mentioned it, and it's extremely fascinating. But actually, if you think about now, because you said it's not 200 years ago, it's now, but actually it seems like the same motivations about humiliation and, kind of like sort of taboo things like that, sexuality, it's kind of like driving most of the way that we sort of like live our lives. I think in general, not just my own research, but any psychological research can assist human rights work, legislation, policy, by providing the evidence that we need. When you've got rigorous evidence, and we know that when psychological research has been published, you can rely on the rigor of the testing to actually say that, I can trust the results that are telling me something. So it's the evidence that supports the credibility, because you already know full well what we're talking about. You had the experience yourself, but now there's like rigorous evidence that like backs it up. It's not just hearsay, it's like things that are shown from data from a lot of people. By targeting beliefs and behaviors that cause harm, can assist in interventions and, obviously in the precision in which we engage with interventions. Like, where do we need to focus? What do we need to do first? And it can strengthen our arguments for law and policy and platform change. Like, we know since 2015, when I started looking at it, and I certainly wasn't the first to start looking at that phenomenon, we've seen massive changes. We've seen changes in platforms like Meta, for example. We've seen changes in Google. We've seen in the UK the introduction of the online abuse, kind of like the Online Safety Act. So it's just things have happened, and it is because of people like yourself, Emma, like policymakers, human rights defenders that have told people, listen up, this is an issue, this is what we need to do. And also the evidence that kept coming through from research that was telling us this is actually something really serious, because the after effects of something like that are really important. People are killing themselves, people are having, sort of like long-term issues with that. We need to step it up. So psychological research obviously has shown us that victim blaming and minimizing harm are not neutral opinions, right? They're not neutral opinions. They're distorted thinking patterns. They're, moral disengagement pattern. That basically what they do is they enable the abuse, and they exonerate and protect the perpetrators. So by blaming the victim, despite what some people may think, oh, actually, but what were they thinking? You are actively being part of excusing and proliferating abuse by basically enabling people to say, oh, actually, well, it's not me, diffusing their responsibility and saying it's someone else's fault. What we can do is we can use evidence-based framing, right? That clearly names, obviously, that it's the perpetrator's choice. It's not the victim's fault for what is happening. Someone chose to do this. Someone else didn't, but that person chose to share images, to engage in those things. So in the specific lack or disregard of consent, these are issues that we need to keep talking, and I'm fairly certain that you do all the time. I do feel that when we do talk, when we sort of like talk about policy, it's really good. It's an additional weapon in our arsenal to cite psychological research that explains why focusing on victim actions is misleading and harmful, and why taking away the focus from the perpetrator is actually harming our cause. And that's the real issue. The real issue, both in legislation, policymaking, is to focus it on the perpetrator. Support the victim, but focus it on the perpetrator. Why do they do that? How can we stop them? Also, what we can do is we can push back on the legal thresholds, right? And this is what activists have been doing all of this time for the last 10 years that I've been sort of like, kind of like looking at the area. They pushed the legal thresholds that required the victims to provide motive, for example. In the legislation here in the UK, before it changed, you had to show that someone had the intent to cause harm. That now has been changed because of the good work of scholars and activists and people and victims, right? That was saying that why should I have to do that? And that happens by pointing to research that shows that online sexual violence is no different to offline sexual violence. And why, if a victim of rape doesn't have to do that, why would a victim of image-based sexual abuse have to do that if they're the same thing? Also, when you have consultations, bring the psychological evidence in these consultations, bring it in, use it to, parliamentary submissions, stakeholder meetings, make your arguments basically harder to dismiss with the evidence that is available. And also what we need to do, and I'm sure you've been doing because you did mention it, is holding platforms and institutions responsible. Okay, people are people, they're going to do that, but there is an element of, oh, this is a platform and it allows me to do that. Therefore, it must be okay because the platform allows me to do that. They are responsible to design their platforms ethically. They are responsible for how their users of the platforms are engaging with the platforms, I feel. And we have to design responses within those platforms and within our institutions, whether, kind of like these are workplaces or anything, that reduce moral disengagement. And we don't allow people to engage in those practices that exonerate kind of like bad behavior and crime. We need to have clearer prompts. For example, if you are about to share something, do you have consent? People depicted in the images, do you have their consent to publish what you have? You touched upon the real issue of parents posting images of their own children. There is no way that you have consent for that. And we know what the real dangers of posting images of children online are, especially in the deepfake era that we are in. So we need stronger consequences and less ambiguity.
Yeah, just all of those points I agree with wholeheartedly. I just wanted to supplement a small thing, which was that oftentimes when I'm out speaking about these subjects, people will ask me, what should I say to my daughter? And say, how should I? And I think it's of course it's said out of care and kindness, but I think something that I have really realized is that when you tell your daughter, don't send naked pictures, you're also telling your son you are not to be trusted, and no one should trust you. And I think this is something that we have covertly been teaching young men for decades, that they are animals. And I think that this has been tremendously counterproductive to have such low expectations of one gender. And I think I often speak about this when I'm out speaking to youth, and I can just see the young boys' ears are perking up because it's not what they expected. So when I say, I become just as disappointed when a young man does this as when a young woman does it, they just say, what? Because they are so used to being spoken about as psychopaths, basically. And I think we really need to check ourselves and to treat young men as human beings as well, because what I see is that the bar for their behavior is so low. The expectations of whether they're able to be kind, empathetic, to have healthy and happy sexual relationships with other young women, no one expects that of them. And then, of course, if no one expects it, they won't. And we allow violators to do this as well, right? So violators will say, oh, any man will do this. And I think it is so important for men to push back on that and say, no, that is simply not true. No, not any man would do this. Not any young boy would do this. There is a kind of confirmation bias in many young men thinking that all other young men do this and participate in it. And it is the people who rebel against it who are the outliers. But actually, when you ask young people about what happened to a person like me, most of them will say, I find that disgraceful. And I think it should be illegal, and I don't think it should happen. So there is an understanding a kind of group misunderstanding among youth that other people are less sympathetic than they really are, less kind, less empathetic than they really are, especially among young men. So I think, having a high bar for young men here is extremely, extremely important. And as soon as you teach young women that they can't trust young men, then we don't have anything that even resembles gender equality, because then we have no freedom of expression, we have no freedom of sexual expression, we have no freedom to have one night stands or party together or travel together and all these things that feminists have fought so hard for us to be able to do. As soon as we create a reality where young men are liars, psychopaths, criminals, untrustworthy until otherwise proven, then we create an incredibly unsafe environment for women, and also an unfair environment for young men that benefits nobody. So even though it is done out of care to teach young women not to trust men, it completely splinters youth communities. And is very, very dangerous. And I think that was just something I was thinking about as Aphrodite was talking, that if anything I've learned from speaking to like thousands of young people about this, it is that as soon as you have high expectations of young men, they become much interested in what you have to say than when yeah, treat them as potential violators other than potential victims, which we must also not forget. They are also that.
I so appreciate that. I think a lot of the stereotypes around feminism is that, feminists are sexist towards men in a way, or want to have power over men. And in fact, it's quite the opposite. It's about relaxing rigid gender roles so that everyone can thrive. I'm sensitive to the fact that we're out of time, but I want to give each of you the opportunity to have a last word. Aphrodite, let's start with you.
I just want to say that I thoroughly enjoyed today. I think it's so amazing to have a conversation like this, be able to hear Emma's perspective that resonates in such a way with me, because I do something very similar in my teaching as well. When I teach about, sexual violence and rape myths and things like that, there's men in the audience, there's young men in there, and I always tell them something, like I always used the same thing that you use. I was like, isn't it insulting in a way that people treat men as if they are nothing but like dogs, basically, that just kind of like salivate at the press of a button, the image of something. You're people with agency, with minds, with choices. You can be victims, like you need to move away from that narrative that says that you don't have agency over your choices and what you choose to do and how you decide. So I think for me, the real sort of like takeaway message is that despite everyone having the capacity to engage in criminal activity, because we are humans and everyone genuinely has that capacity, and the research has shown us that actually it's not the so gendered arena that we once thought it was. There are men that are victims of image-based sexual abuse. There are women that are perpetrators of image-based sexual abuse. So what we want to focus on, I guess, is the concept of empathy and the concept of kind of like decency and understanding and being able to have that trust. I really, really, that the concept of trust that Emma mentioned really resonates with me. And I think that this is possibly the best way forward, is for us to focus on building trust, either in the systems that we use, in, kind of like the people that surround us. It's kind of like collaborating and building trust, I guess.
I just sit here kind of thinking back a little when I started this work in 2014 and when I was a victim in 2011. I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that it was quite a lonely type of work. There were not that many people in universities. There were not that many victims who were publicly out about their experience. It was very lonely. And I think it just gives me both a tremendous sense of accomplishment on a human level that is no longer the case, but also on a more personal level, it gives me such a sense of peace that I can continue, working in a different direction, doing my work on feminist economics, doing my work on care work, and knowing that it's being kept up without me. That there are, all over the world, such smart people and caring people who continue to advocate for victims' rights and trying to find out what we need and how to better our circumstances. And I think I can without a doubt say that that a young woman like me who this happens to in 2026 is just simply not in the same situation that I was in 2011. She will have much more possibility of recourse, criminal helplines, ability to remove images from Google, something that was just unfathomable when this happened to me. So I think it's my biggest privilege is to have entire days where I don't think about this at all. And I actually have that now, and I didn't have that for over a decade. And that seems like a tremendous step forward for victims of this type of crime. And I just want to thank you both for helping make that possible for me, that I can just sit in a cafe and have a drink and not think about this at all. That is just the biggest gift anyone could ever give me. So thank you so much for that.
Thank you, Emma. Thank you, Afroditi. On that note, we will post about Emma's book, and we'll also post some resources for victim survivors in addition to this podcast. Thank you both, and keep the conversation going.
Thank you for listening. That was Mindbridge, where science meets human rights. To learn more about how we use brain and behavioral science to empower human rights defenders, find us at mindbridgecenter.org and follow us on social media.